Hello, Culminators. Thanks again for joining us. This is going to be a very interesting conversation with a very interesting man named Erec Smith. And it's a shame if you haven't heard about him yet, but I think that you will be hearing a lot more about him. He is involved with what I will call, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but an academic and I think a social and cultural movement in the world of anti-racism, or in this case, arguably anti-racism. He is an associate professor of rhetoric, so don't try any funny business, at York University in Pennsylvania. And like me, I have just learned he is a fellow New Jersey man. So thank you for joining us, Professor Smith, Erec Smith.
Thanks for having me.
You have some very interesting stuff going on out there. And to a large extent, the handful of people or so who watch this podcast are probably fairly familiar with the issues of what's going on with wokeness and anti-racism. And in fact, I have had on the program some of the leading lights in the popular culture of people who are criticizing these movements. James Lindsay, young guys like Adam Coleman, and of course James McWhorter. I've not had him on my show, and I don't think he'll ever acknowledge my existence. But my wife wrote a very interesting book review about his very interesting book. What I would like to start out with, though, is for you to give a sense to our audience of what it is you probably understand I'm talking about, the Heterodox Academy and the work that that you're doing in Black Thoughts. I think people will really be interested in knowing what's out there and where you're coming from.
Well, there are various ways to start that conversation or answer that question. So I'm just going to randomly pick one and hopefully spread out and touch on everything else. When about 3 years ago, I realized in academia, specifically my field of rhetoric and composition, that there was a very illiberal movement going on that many people call quote unquote woke. What happened was that there was a keynote address at a conference. And the point of this address was that, expecting students of color to write standard English or have certain habits of mind was inherently racist. And the white people in the room need to know that they are inherently racist in a lot of ways. In fact, he used the term suffocated by whiteness when he talked about students of color in the classroom. So I went on a listserv and said, was that the best idea? Should we really be saying this about our students and each other? And the backlash started everything.
This is before, were you at York then, or were you at an institution that will not be named?
I was at York College.
Okay,
But nothing else was going on, really. Free Black Thought, which I'll talk about momentarily. Heterodox.
Free Black Thought.
I was a part of that, but I wasn't, really into it. And when that happened, I realized, okay, I got to do something, because for the most part, I'm the only one speaking up. And if they treated a Black person like this, then many other people don't have a chance, right?
So let me get this straight. When you say you're the only one speaking up, you mean at York?
No. York's fine. York's fine. York College, that's fine. My field.
In the field of rhetoric and composition.
Yes. So, I mean, there are people who chime in here and there, right? But they don't, and understandably so, they don't want to deal with all this mess.
Yeah.
Right. So I figured the onus is on me to do it. I'm an associate professor now, not an assistant. So I have some job security there. And I decided to, really shift my my career a bit. I was working on a book that I not totally, but mostly revamped after this incident to reflect the incident and the problems so that people can know what's going on. I also became the moderator of Heterodox Rec Comp, which is, a place where you can, voice your opinions without being mobbed on social media regarding things in the field.
That's for academics primarily, right?
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I ended up co-founding something called Free Black Thought. Now, this is a website and online journal dedicated to showcasing viewpoint diversity within the African-American clerisy, for lack of a better term. So not all Black people think the same. They don't vote the same. All right. They don't have the same hopes and dreams. They don't have the same fears. Right. And they don't have the same sensibilities when it comes to insults and things like that. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that's not the case. They think all Black people are the same. So what this website does and journal is showcase that no, Black people are not the same. They have viewpoints that aren't really represented in the mainstream media. So we're going to represent them here. And we also have a journal that's had some prominent voices, Glenn Lowry, George Yancey, and that's going well. And that's basically what I'm all about these days.
Well, that's a lot, and it gives us plenty to talk about, because it is certainly in the current political environment, it's just about as heterodox as you could want to be. I mean, one of the things that I learned from James Lindsay was that race was the wedge issue that got Marxist, not Marxism, but the Marxist approach or Marxian approach to critical everything into academia, and resulted in this contempt for traditional academic concepts of problem solving and searching for truth. Because there was a bona fide race problem in this country, and it was something that to hear James explain it, actually comports with my understanding of history. That was decided by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and obviously with its friends here, to be an area that they would constantly pound on, because it was one of the few where U.S. society could not really point proudly to how it was doing compared to communism, which didn't really have a race issue. Mm-hmm. And here you are now, 70 years later, in academia, and notwithstanding what would obviously, by any objective measure, have to be regarded as phenomenal progress compared to the 1950s.
Yeah.
The whole tenor and the whole approach of what we do of what academia has become seems to reflect a completely upside down world. You must feel very fortunate to be at a place at York where you say they're pretty good.
Yeah, it is pretty good here, and I realize how fortunate I am. But I mean, every school at one point was pretty good until it wasn't, right? So I have to stay vigilant regarding that.
Yeah, I had Robert George on here a year and a half ago, maybe it was a year ago, and he was pretty much crowing about how they had pushed back on the Joshua Katz issue, which again is not the race issue per se, but it's all the same. I think you'd have to agree that it's the same phenomenon of intolerance and sort of a cultural revolution kind of approach to dealing with people and with dissent.
Well, you mentioned Marxist thought, and you alluded to the Frankfurt School. For a good century, cultural Marxists have been using people of color, specifically Black people, for their purposes. And it's not just Herbert Marcuse in the 60s who looked at, you know, Black people and said, we don't need to convince white people to join the proletariat. You know, they're already pissed at the world. They're already upset with the country and things like that and the way things are. Let's just ride that. Leon Trotsky did the same thing. You know, he said the white proletariat is nothing compared to the Black people who could really lead the charge.
I thought Marcuse was actually said that it's going too well. America has a middle class, which Marx hadn't really counted on, and it acts as a buffer that prevents class consciousness from really forming. But we don't have that in the Black world in America, because there's such a small and brittle middle class, and there's our target.
Right. There's and
plus there are these great liberal impulses that we can play on in the faculty lounges. People do want to do the right thing.
Yeah, right.
There's this general sense of Americans are in favor of fair play. And gosh, we won World War II. What does that mean we stand for? And from that springs the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. All right, but then here we are.
Right.
So Free Black Thought, are you one of the co-founders of Free Black Thought?
Yes.
And when was that created?
2 years ago.
So this is a fairly fresh initiative.
Yes.
Have you what kind of pushback have you gotten?
For that, not much, you know, because that's a sticky situation for them. You know, here's a Black person who's speaking his truth about diversity of thought and things like that, and they tend to stay away from that situation. Some people will, you know, call it out, quote unquote, as being ultra conservative, which it very much is not, right? But other than that, which is a erroneous charge, we haven't really gotten much pushback. You know, I get more pushback on the individual level from other scholars in my field.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that not gratuitous stuff? Obviously, I don't have to tell you that, but if you could give us a sense of what we wouldn't just merely guess at, which is that you're not a favorite at certain conferences.
Right. I'm not a favorite. It's well, because I don't back down. I'm a person of color, right? And the things I say are reasonable, you know, relative to the things that my opponents are saying.
Well, not only are the things you say reasonable, I watched a YouTube presentation that you gave. I think it was for the Heterodox Academy. Mm-hmm. It was 24 minutes long. And I said, this guy is obviously, yes, this was New Paradigms. No, that wasn't New Paradigms. It was a critique of anti-racism in rhetoric.
Yes.
And I said, Erec sounds like all of them. In other words, you absolutely have, you're working entirely within the paradigms, the academic paradigms that are established in this field. I'm seeing you, I'm hearing, and I don't claim to be an expert in it, but in a way, even more than I think John McWhorter, you're, who I think stands outside of it to some extent in terms of his critique, or at least in last year's book. In this video, you use a lot of the terminology and, again, the paradigms of anti-racism and critical legal studies, and to a large and neutrally. In many respects, you acknowledge that there are things that we have learned from critical legal studies. I'm sorry, critical race theory.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that the fact that you're not standing outside of this particular silo in the academy and saying, you guys you're just slinging bullshit. This is just like, you're just finding ways to rationalize some kind of big power grab. But you seem to really be intellectually engaging and using this sort of analysis that actually should work from the point of view of the people who don't agree with you.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, yes, I understand what you're saying, and I've said this a lot. You know, my too many of my colleagues in the field aren't rhetoric professors who are doing social justice activism. They're social justice activists doing rhetoric, which is a very different thing, right? They I forget, somebody wrote an article a couple of weeks ago, and I'm blanking on his name, but he basically called this out too, and he said, especially the field of rhetoric and composition is kind of like a Trojan horse situation, right? I'm gonna go here, get my degree in rhetoric and not teach rhetoric at all. I'm going to teach my version of what social justice should be. And you speak of Marxism earlier. The person who gave the speech that I talked about at the beginning of this interview is a card-carrying Marxist. He will tell you proudly, and for as long as you will listen, right, that he is a Marxist. And if you go back to 100 years ago, 102 years ago, Lenin talking about education and saying, you know, communism is the alpha and the omega of education. Yeah, we may teach math, but math insofar as it can help us buttress communism. History insofar as it can help us buttress communism. And that's going on today. In fact, if you, and I just told somebody else this, if you replaced communism in Lenin's speech with anti-racism, sounds a lot like Ibram X. Kendi. It sounds a lot like Robin DiAngelo.
Sure, absolutely.
You know? And yeah.
And by virtue of both of them essentially being statements of religious faith, there's a real limit, notwithstanding that, you know, you have mastered the terminology and the analytical frameworks that you're criticizing, which is the least you can do when you criticize a field.
Yeah.
To some extent, I guess. There's still a point at which no matter what you say, it simply isn't going to matter, because it's not really a discussion. I mean, do you think, who are you talking to? Are you talking to fellow academics? Like when that Marxist who loves to talk about his faith to you, like any true evangelical, is he listening to you, or is that a one-way conversation?
That's a one-way conversation, but I stopped talking to them a long time ago. When I do talk to them, I'm using them as a catalyst for speaking, you know, my thoughts to the people who are listening in.
Oh yeah, I understand,
right?
that. As somebody who spends too much time, I still am stung by a comment that my former professor and friend Sean Wilentz made to me about what a waste of time Twitter is. But it's a very important part of the work that I do in the sort of social activism. And people often say to me, "Why are you responding to this guy? He's nothing." I said, "No, I have no interest in trying to convince this person of anything. But I have 200,000 people who are watching to see what I have to." I mean, that's an opportunity for me to frame things and, you know, and draw out the point. So I understand that. So then so it's the people who are listening, and that might be, in other words, at a speaking event or in your writing and, you know, whatever things that you publish.
Yeah, and the people who are still on the fence about things, the people who are a little confused about what's going on, the people who think they must be missing something because this isn't making sense, I'm talking to them and letting them know through modeling pushback as well as my words that, you know, you're not missing anything. It doesn't make sense, you know, and they know it doesn't make sense. The point isn't to make sense. The point is to acquire power, right? As much power as possible. And I mean, that can't be more apparent than in the field of rhetoric, because we are about communication and they refuse to communicate, right? Rhetoric doesn't make sense in a world where there's just one way of looking at things. It doesn't make sense. Rhetoric is about different ideas and somebody trying to persuade other people of his or her idea. So
let's take a step back, because what you just described sounds to me as a lawyer as a description of the Socratic method.
Mm-hmm.
What is the study of rhetoric? Because I believe that when I was in college, if there was a course on rhetoric, I didn't know about it, but there certainly wasn't a discipline or a department. What is it? How does a guy like you find himself there?
Well, at one point in the history of humanity, rhetoric and jurisprudence were combined.
Right.
So the lawyers had to take courses in this. Those days are gone, obviously, but rhetoric's still very important because we all use it, whether we know the definition of it or not. The definition, and I always go to Aristotle. The definition of rhetoric is the ability to discern in any given situation the available means of persuasion. And what that means is, if you're trying to convince people that they should buy your new line of vodka, you're going to speak differently to a fraternity than you are to a bunch of church ladies, right? Right. So certain things, certain metaphors, certain references are available to you and certain ones are not. So discerning that and speaking accordingly is to respect rhetoric. That's the simple definition of it.
Is it allied to I know that rhetoric, as you mentioned, was historically something that all educated people studied. Is it allied with the more contemporary field of, what am I thinking of? It's the study of symbolism.
Semantics? Semiology?
Semiology, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's overlap. There's overlap with social linguistics. There's overlap with English literature and literary criticism. There's a lot of overlap that rhetoric has with various fields because, well, it's about communication and all those fields have to communicate.
And you're really and you're really getting to the heart of the matter, because one of the techniques of Marxian power, what is it called? The power acquisition is, and this is a big topic with McWhorter, obviously, changing the definition of semantics and words and meaning so that it's either impossible to dispute a proposition because you have defined its opposite out of existence, or you simply refuse to acknowledge the existence of contrary propositions, in a way that's it's antithetical to, again, what the Socratic approach of positing alternatives and exploring them, whether they're realistic or not. This is the nature of the rhetoric that we see in the woke world.
Mm-hmm.
So you're coming from this traditional place of, let's understand how, is it fair to say that there's also a sort of linguistic concept that human brains think a certain way? In order to be understood, in order to communicate, we have to acknowledge that we can't, for example, this is not a great example. I don't know what a woman is. I'm not a biologist. Okay, we're going to completely change everything you know about how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, because communism demands it, because wokeness demands it, we're going to change genetics. We're going to change biology. How can you use an intellectual discipline to overcome a movement or a cultural trend and an academic trend that is, by definition, doesn't accept first principles of objective truth and or how truth is, how you search for truth, or again how human brains comprehend propositions and analyze them. Does that question make sense?
Yeah. So there are various answers to that question, and they all overlap. So I'll just start with the one that's at the forefront of my mind right now, and that is reminding people of the tenets of classical liberalism. You know, why we embrace equality, why we embrace freedom of speech, why we embrace individuality and the right to say no, you know, and things like that. And explaining that, you know, those things came about so that we can be as fulfilled as possible, so that we can have the right and ability for life, liberty, and happiness, right? So I would do that, just remind people of that. And then I would point out, expose the woke, right?
Let me just ask you, the audience that you have in mind now when you're explaining this, is it a student audience? Is it young people?
It's everyone.
It's everyone.
Yes.
Everyone seeking truth and answers and understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Please.
No problem. When you talked about people redefining terms, right? And you know, not acknowledging the fact that there is a redefinition, right? Redefining a term and pretending this has always been the term, right? Or this always should have been the term. That is an attempt to confuse, right? It's an attempt to dizzy people, because dizzy people are easier to knock down, right? Dizzy people are easier to manipulate and control. For example, changing the definition of racism to something that can only come from white people and not something that Black people can do, right? If you really wanted to make your point to an audience, you would use adjectives, right? There's hegemonic racism and counter-hegemonic racism. There's traditional racism, and then there's contemporary racism, in which Black people can, you would explain it like that. The fact that they would change a definition of a term, not tell people, and when they get it wrong, yell at them, right? That is proof that they're trying to confuse you. They have no interest in actually explaining things. They want power. And if they can knock you down, they can build things back up in the world they want. So just pointing that out, pointing the obvious out, right?
That's a fantastic. I love that point about the use of adjectives, because I'm a lawyer, I'm a writer. I have to expressing myself I'm a podcaster. Expressing myself I'm married to a writer. We talk about, we're marking each other's papers up all the time.
Yeah.
And that's just an incredibly powerful point. When you language that is devoid of adjectives, that's a tell.
Right.
Too many adjectives is also a tell, because then your language is, then your expression is too flexible, because you're not telling, I want to know concreteness, I want nouns, and I want to know action, who really did what. And if you keep telling me something was outrageous and something was racist, what was one of my big issues, I'm not in any way imputing any political meaning to you, but I was a Trump supporter. And when he was a president, and I still am, whatever it is he's doing now, I'm sure I support his golf game. I would always try to get people, including my own mom, what was the action, what was the policy of Donald Trump that you disagree with? I hate him. He's terrible. Show me. Don't show me. Don't tell me. Okay, a little bit of a. But too many adjectives is bad. But no adjectives is telling you that someone is trying to confuse. I guess it's a categorization exercise.
Okay. Yeah.
And they're moving. They're sliding around where the sweet spot is in the definition and reestablishing it. Okay. Although isn't it also the case, something you said, they yell at you, right? Because they're not, you should know it's not really the definition. Here's the real, but don't they also, isn't there also a point of view or an approach that definition, like the definition of marriage, may have always, they're not going to claim it always included same-sex marriage, but what they'll claim is that the definition of marriage has not included same-sex marriage because of a power imbalance. And we're going to remove that power imbalance, and that's the only thing that's preventing men from marrying men. To which you and I, as people who are hung up on words, say, I'm not talking about the policy of whether or not men can have the same benefits as marriage if they marry a man as if they marry a woman. Like that's a policy discussion. But you're going to tell me that it is marriage. I mean, marriage means it has an integrative aspect to it. It's the metaphor is used. In fact, I think marriage in human relations might even be a metaphor from other kinds of marriage of combining, which no, that there's no reason men can't be married to men. You have to get run outside of your, the patriarchal definition of what those words mean. So that, all I'm asking is, it's not always, they're not claiming that. Oh, I guess that does prove what you're saying, which is that, Ron, you were blocked off from understanding that marriage could mean anything. It always could mean anything. And now that we've gotten rid of our prejudices, it can mean same-sex marriage.
Well, what your statements remind me of is the need to agree on operational definitions, right? One of the questions we should be asking first and foremost, and this is also one of the things that I would do in addition to explaining classical liberalism and pointing out the lack of adjectives and things like that. What we need to do is first and foremost ask people, okay, what do you mean by diversity? Can you define that clearly? What do you mean by equity? Can you define that clearly? The definitions should be a conversation. In fact, if you're going to have a conference or a panel discussion or a debate, there should be a 20-minute preface in which you're talking about definitions. All right, let's settle on what we mean by X, Y, and Z right now before we get into this, so that we don't confuse each other, or that you don't manipulate me and try to confuse me with your vague definitions, right? So clarifying what certain terms means is very important for people who are really trying to get to the bottom of things.
I mean, certainly, in my work, there are these terms of art, and there are these legal definitions, legal concepts, which courts have sometimes spent hundreds of years debating what the meanings are. Okay, so you mentioned a couple of things that you would do in your sort of approach to getting people to open themselves up intellectually to knowing, to dealing with these issues in a more productive way. One is, that sort of adjectives trick. Number two is, let's get our definitions, which is to some extent a variation. It's the flip side of the adjectives issue. Mm-hmm. What other tools are there?
Well, I would inform them of where, concepts like critical race theory come from, right? They derive from critical theory, which derives from cultural Marxist thought, which derives from the Frankfurt School, which was made up of a lot of people that, I don't know, for lack of a better term, enjoyed alternative ways of doing things, right? I was reading one person last week who said that Marcuse was he wasn't just a cultural Marxist, he was a sex Marxist. He was trying to spin our ideas of sexuality, and that's fine, but what they were trying to do is create a world where their idiosyncrasies were normal, where they weren't misfits. There's an overlap of occult, sentiments in the Frankfurt School. There is a, excuse me, sorry. there's a group of people who, had a verbal fascination with Lucifer, right? They saw Lucifer as a wonderful symbol of revolt, right? So they embraced that. These are,
No, you choose the word Lucifer because they use the word Lucifer because Lucifer
yes,
is the name of the angel whose name embodies light,
yes,
who rebels against God and
yes.
and falls into hell and becomes the prince of that domain and God's opposition. So that's this great metaphor for revolt, because we have a right to challenge God, and we're made of the same good stuff as the other angels, but we're here to tell you the truth.
Yeah, and they were part of being a Marxist was being an atheist as well. So there's also that.
But I mean,
yeah.
does that move anyone anymore?
What?
Like, I don't even think in York, Pennsylvania, people are shocked by somebody being an atheist.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just I'm adding a point to the Lucifer thing.
Yeah. Oh no. I okay.
Yeah. So I would also point that out. Like, where is this coming from? Where is it derived? And not to make a genetic fallacy to say that, well, okay, if there's an idea that somebody I don't like 20 years ago made, that I don't like the idea now, even though it's a good idea. I'm not saying do that, but I am saying, look into the origins of this and who were the people who came up with these ideas and why, right? And you may get some interesting insights.
I get that. I think that's already asking a lot of a lot of people, because people, especially Americans, I think, tend to be very pragmatic and interested in, okay, but what's the, all right, but let's, whatever, they were nuts, fine. But listen, there are so many people who are comfortable with Marxism despite what an awful person Marx was,
Right.
And also so little historical understanding of what communism was about. Is your focus seems to be based on the websites and on stuff that I've had a chance to look over. It seems to be on the world of academia. Do you anticipate or see a way where this conversation spills over into the broader culture? I mean, is this part of it? Is this what we're doing?
Yes, Jess. It has spilled over to the broader culture, and I mean, you have to address that. I mean, yes, the origins, to a large extent, are academic, but that's not the case anymore. It's this stuff is not just for academia anymore. It is an activist ideology, and it's in corporate America. It's in churches, right?
Yes, 100%. And in fact, you mentioned corporate America. That would have been that would be my next, my next question. I mean, we seem to have reached a point where I mean, I guess I have seen some indication that there's been some pushback on some of the, some shareholder activism and some even, I think, let's use Disney as an example of a massive company with massive influence, in which traditionally you could argue was one of the most small c conservative cultural institutions in the United States, painting an unrealistic, to a large extent, picture of traditional mores, princes and princesses and beautiful families, and not certainly the kind of this, again, this very traditional vision. Now, the way they folded to pressure on the Florida bill was really an extraordinary thing to see. I mean, it was just so transparent. How do you think, again, that it's about power and not about ideas, once Marxists get power over an institution, and one of the big areas I work in is corporate censorship. you know, cancel culture.
Mhm.
So all the institutions that once stood for free speech, free expression, tolerance, now that they have obtained control of the institutions in which those subjects were once entertained by them, they're not interested in those principles anymore. And then this is academia as well, obviously, academic inquiry. So I don't even have to ask the question on the corporate level, on the academic level. I guess to some extent, this is back to my first question. If wokeness has overwhelmed an institution like my alma mater, Princeton, where it appears that there's this management, dean, royalty, people who are not actually typically genuine intellectuals, they're academic administrators, and you've got a college president who has he has bona fide academic credentials, but he's become part of the system. They're either committed to racial critical race theory, or believe that they must act in accordance with critical race theory. Is there anything is there a conversation? Is there an activist approach that can be utilized to crack that once the power has already been obtained?
Yes, and there are ways to do anti-racism without embracing critical race theory. There are ways to do it without, being relatively illiberal about it.
Oh, in other words, this goes back to your point that remind them of how did we get here? What are the true liberal values?
Well, yes, but also remind them that there are other ways of going about this. You can fix race relations without devolving into oppressor oppressed, and sticking with that like it's a mutable or immutable characteristic of people, right? You can do this without using intersectionality as a way of marking ethos and not as just a way of describing as objectively as possible, certain people, right?
Well, you just said something I remembered from your video about the intersectionality was something that you felt was a legitimate contribution, intellectual contribution from critical race theory.
Yes.
Can you explain to people who are listening to this what you meant by that? Because it's a fascinating idea, because if you are open-minded and you do see the streams of social phenomena, and over time you could appreciate what the appeal of intersectionality would be, but I think a lot of people use the term without necessarily understanding it.
Well, intersectionality is a concept that basically has people recognize that not every person is more than just one thing, right? We are an intersection of demographics. I'm Black, but I'm straight, middle class, able-bodied, and I have those characteristics that are deemed privileged, as opposed to the more underprivileged, demographic characteristics, like a minority race, being disabled, being gay or lesbian or trans or something like that. And yes, initially that's a great idea, because okay, well, you're a feminist, let's say, and I'm a feminist, but my Black feminism is going to be a little bit different from yours, right? So I have to do with race and misogyny, right? So that's a good concept. However,
in other words, it's a concept for analyzing relationships and the geometry of how people see the world and experience the world, depending on those qualities.
Yes.
Okay, yes.
But now it's been spun by the likes of Robin DiAngelo and other people who call themselves critical social justice pedagogues, theorists, activists, whatever. Now it's a marker of ethos, right? Now, if you have more downtrodden intersections and privileged ones, you get to talk. If your intersections are mostly privileged, you are not allowed to talk. You have to listen, right? That's why if you're male, straight, middle to upper class, able-bodied, then you have to shut up and listen, right? Even if you have a question or a good point to make.
So this privilege and is it underprivileged or unprivileged?
Either.
Is that concept that comes out of intersectionality? That's where is that where that's born?
Well, I mean, that comes out of, an analogy to bourgeois proletariat, right? Oppressor, oppressed. That's just another variation of that dichotomy. And that's applied to intersectionality in ways that, mark ethos. Who has the credibility to talk and who doesn't?
Oh, I mean, and this was something when I was in college, when I first, experienced this idea that men were not entitled to have opinions on topics that were only relevant to women. And it was an astonishing proposition to me. It was honored far more in the breach than in the observance, of course. But the idea that would be a way to stop a conversation, and you see it all the time in social media. Yeah. So that in and of itself is if you can get across that, all right. So you're telling me that that's how it's been spun, but in fact, that's not the legitimate application of this of what can be a fairly value neutral analytical framework.
Yes. Yes.
How about your students? First of all, is there a difference between your students and the students at York? I'm going to ask this question to Robert George. You said, I have to admit most of the people who take my courses know what I'm about. So they're not necessarily typical of what the thinking is on campus. Are you reaching people beyond those who are already inclined to hear what you have to say?
I don't really know, if I'm doing that. I'm sure some of my students know what I'm about. I'm not sure if everybody else does. Nobody talks about it at your college.
Interesting.
Of PA. Yeah, it's nobody brings up what I'm doing, at heterodox, free Black thought, fair, and things like that. It's just, we teach the subject matter, we leave. So I don't really know.
Okay, think. Fair enough. I believe it or not, we've used up quite a bit of your time, and I really appreciate it. Is there anything you think? I flashed on the screen the heterodoxy website and the Black Thought website. I asked you. Well, I approached the Free Black Thought web, account on Twitter, saying, "Hey, can you send me someone to have this discussion?" And they knew exactly who to send me, obviously. I want to recommend to people who are listening to follow these accounts also, because that feeling you get. This might not be so much for you because I think you have a disciplined life and don't spend as much time on Twitter as some of us, but you find an account and realize, oh gosh, I can't retweet everything on this page, but how have I been missing all this? There's a lot of really good stuff on here, and you've got some really interesting thinkers. Are you confident that you and the people you're working with on these projects can shift the conversation back to something a little bit less emotional and a little bit less moralistic?
I think we have a shot. Yeah. And we're growing. We have all kinds of plans. Podcasts. We've already co-sponsored events and things like that. And we're growing in some help and things like that. We just acquired an intern who's brilliant, right? And grant funding. I mean, onward and upward. So I'm pretty confident in it.
Thank you very much for this introduction to what you guys are doing and to the building blocks, the intellectual building blocks of what this is about. There is definitely a lot out there for people who are as intrigued as I am by Erec Smith. People want to, the good thing about you is that you've got this very distinctively spelled first name. So if it were Erec Smith spelled with an I, might be like Ronald Coleman. Very easy to find Google results, but not necessarily the one you're looking for.
Yeah.
Where are you from?
New Jersey.
Oh, that's right. You're from Jersey.
Yeah.
That's right. Where'd you go to high school?
Rancocas Valley Regional High School in Mount Holly, New Jersey.
Mount Holly. That's right. Yeah, that's nice country down there. You're right. New York, North Jersey, and South Jersey are really different states, and they have been for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
I remember hearing that people during the Civil War, there was even a perception that the gentleman farmers of South Jersey were sympathetic to the South, and the more urbanized, northern. I mean, we say urbanized, nothing like what it means today, but that the far more settled northern New Jersey thought of itself as a New England kind of place, and that split has. We have that political split now too. There's Republican New Jersey and Democratic New Jersey.
There was, before I even knew the information you just said about the South Jersey sympathizers with the Confederacy, I would tell people the Mason-Dixon line runs through Trenton.
Yeah, exactly. Trenton.
That's where, yeah.
That's right. And Princeton was below it.
Yeah.
It was known as basically as the most southern of the Ivies.
Yeah.
Well, again, I thank you very much. I hope we can chat again, and I'm going to be looking out for the kinds of, for your conferences and stuff. And you let non-professors in, I'm going to try to sneak in and catch a little bit of it.
You got it.
I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good meeting you.